Welcome back to Evolving from Religious Trauma. Lesson 5, Being and Becoming. I started recycling several years ago. It always seemed like a promising idea. In fact, there was one company I worked for that recycled about 95% of the material they used. They had done it for years and become very proficient at it. Various containers were strategically placed up and down our assembly line. They emptied them routinely, and adherence to the program was expected and normal. We all want to get better. We want to heal our planet, or at least most people do. We want to somehow deal with our trauma, and most of us want to get in shape and be healthy. But the problem with getting better is that most often, when we try to do better, we experience it as pain. It may or may not be painful, but it seems hard because it requires something of us. I quit recycling at home because I became interested in other projects. Recycling just seemed like arduous work. We do not do challenging work sometimes because it feels like pain. Psychologists tell us that humans seek pleasure and avoid pain. This root sense of what to avoid and what to pursue is a logical way to stay alive. Eating the right foods and avoiding dangerous animals might be wise and valuable choices. But if we're going to improve our lives, pain is most often involved. Everyday advertisements tell us about a more pain-free way to make all our dreams come true. Even religion offers us a better way by promising miracles and inviting us to bypass our suffering with superficial platitudes. But history teaches us that all change is painful. It may not be as bad as we thought, and it will usually be worth it, but there will be some pain when we decide to change or do better. The best example of this for me, was two-a-day practices in high school. My friend and I were employed locally, but still had to go to practice before and after work to get in shape. We thought we were in shape, but our coach knew we needed a higher fitness level if we were ever going to compete against other teams. Changing our bodies from mere high school students to athletes was going to require some pain. It hurt at first, a lot. In fact, after the first day, I could barely move. But one of my brothers used to also try to quit after the first day of school of football practice, but my dad would not let him. My coaches and my dad knew that the pain would decrease in intensity after a few days, and we would be stronger, faster, and able to leap bigger toadstools in a single bound. There are only about 3 options for pain. Pain, or discomfort at least, is always necessary for growth. We do not always have to make great strides in our life, but when we want to do something new or heal our trauma, it involves pain. Number 1 is quitting. Quitting could have many voices. It might sound something like this: I give up. I don't want to do this. I shouldn't have tried. Or maybe I'll just naturally get in shape. Maybe I'll get better, or the pain will just go away. Maybe God will. I'm sure God wants, dot, dot, dot. The universe surely will deliver. I can always start tomorrow when I'm not as busy. Everything gets better with action towards a desired outcome. I authored this poem in one of the painful chapters in the Being book. The first step may seem like it's daunting. To take it seems almost too massive. But then we lean in, and then and again, we learn there's no progress that's passive. Exercise hurts a little at first, but walking up a flight of stairs will eventually hurt if we do not exercise. Dealing with our trauma may seem daunting at first, but when we persist, little by little, it makes our lives much better. Avoiding the unfinished business of our life guarantees we will see it again when it surfaces at the wrong time. Second way we might approach this idea of suffering and changing is to numb. When we encounter pain and when we're trying to do something, we may numb that pain. Most of us opt for numbing the pain in some way. We have lots of options for this: hobbies, church, activities, drugs, alcohol, food, and work, which can be productive, can also cause us problems. Those things don't make the pain go away, they just hide it for a while. They keep us from feeling it for a little while, and then most often it comes back in a more substantial way later. The last option is number 3. How do we deal with pain? Leaning in is the third thing. The only practical option for dealing with pain is to lean into it. As some would say, to heal it, we have to feel it. We still feel the pain, but when we are present with it, it has a chance to get better. When we lean into the discomfort of exercise, we allow ourselves to get in better shape. When we are present with our trauma, we find healing and transformation. When we sit with our questions and the uneasiness, we give ourselves the chance to have purer spiritual experiences and to grow in awareness. Leaning into our pain moves us from reacting to responding. Before we know it, things get more accessible instead of harder. It does not mean that everything is perfect or without struggle, but it does mean that we engage with our struggles. As hard as that sounds, some part of our journey can even be more challenging. Early in life, I learned the value of working hard. By setting goals, staying committed, and striving for personal excellence, people could do anything they wanted, or at least that's what I believed. I was good at pursuing what excited me and built a good life for myself and my family. Eventually, I found this way of doing was not enough. I had to face the reality that along the way I had accumulated some residual trauma. My way of life accomplished things, but it avoided the things I didn't have time to address. 20 years in small town ministry meant that I had some fantastic experiences. Still, unfortunately, it also meant that I spent over 2 decades avoiding and bypassing what I felt deep inside. I learned that I needed some deep healing, and I discovered that it would not go away naturally. I also realized the necessary process of being instead of just doing. I was about to learn that being was not passive like I had imagined, and it was the only way to find the true self that I heard others talk about. I had sometimes touched that part of me, but I was about to discover a new journey of presence and authenticity more incredible than I could have imagined. Because of my background, presence and authenticity seemed passive. I imagined them as something weird that people talk about as they bypass real life. I discovered that in my religion, I was the one bypassing the tough and necessary work of healing by engaging in religious platitudes and avoiding challenging work. The journey toward presence and authenticity would be a leaning and learning that moved me closer to wholeness. In my book, Being, A Journey Towards Presence and Authenticity, I described this experience in more detail, but this summary should provide a framework for what I experienced. Your experience may differ slightly, but these 3 steps help us learn to live a life of being and becoming. I know it will be beneficial for you. Step 1 then is facing our woundedness. The weekend was different than the times before. Often things that seemed unusual triggered me. Laura and I would just be talking or doing everyday things, and something would cause us to argue or experience tension. We never really resolve these things, we just stuff them down. But this weekend was different. Where I repeatedly reacted to everything that happened in the wrong way. My usual pattern was to bypass the issue, stuff it down, and go back to my life. But this weekend was different. Eventually, I found myself wandering around a track, not sure how I got there. I felt like my thoughts were crashing into each other, and everything I had ever pushed down was coming up at once. I knew what this felt like, but I had never felt it so severe. It was too big and intense, and I did not know what to do. I came back to the house and fell asleep, and Laura and I talked, but we were not getting anywhere, and the experience had me exhausted. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I went back to work. But this time, going to work did not solve any problems. By the time I got there, I was a mess. I couldn't attend a meeting that was outside my office, so I made an excuse and started trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, my plans led to a hermitage where I would attend a spiritual direction training later that week. I talked to two spiritual directors for that first day via text. I sat in a chair and texted Laura, then I started blaming other people. My friend encouraged me to do some shadow work and told me to investigate several books. I fell asleep exhausted that night without a plan or an idea of what to do. I thought I should pray for a miracle. I believed that God could intervene, but I also realized how seldom that happened and that I often use this idea to bypass leaning into the issues I faced. It's called bypassing, which may be one of our most significant spiritual pitfalls. The next day, I began reading Robert Augustus Master's book, Bringing Your Shadow Out of the Dark. I read every word, underlining, highlighting, and writing notes on my laptop. I wanted to get this right, and if I could not go to work, I would work as hard as I could at this process. So eventually, the book told me to place my hand where I felt what I am feeling. I knew my heart had been knotted up for several days, and I eventually said, to the part of me that felt rejected and abused, I see you. I understand why you are feeling this way, and I've got your back. As I was present with this felt sense of a younger me, my life flashed before my eyes. I kept seeing my kids and grandkids, and I was muttering, I've got your back, I've got your back, and weeping in a way that I never had. This went on for what seemed like hours. Afterward, I was exhausted, but I also felt reborn. I know now what I experienced was a form of focusing. I had learned something similar earlier that year, but I did not in any way know what I was doing. I was very simply leaning in to my pain. When I did this, my trauma began to shift, and I started to experience a being and becoming that I could not have ever imagined. About 18 months later, I wrote down my experience, and to some degree, I relived all the emotions. Just like the initial examination, it was painful, but it was also worth it. Whenever I encountered my woundedness, I could move towards wholeness and authenticity. I shared it with my friend, Mark Karras, who encouraged me to go deeper. Step two, going deeper. My first reaction was to resist, but when I wrote down my story, I understood this leaning in and how it might be beneficial. So I agreed to send him what I wrote. I dove into each subject, which later became part two of the book. I learned about my fear and how it caused me to freeze and not face certain things. I realized it was beneath other things like anger, and I sometimes pretended to be brave when I was afraid. I also understood or started understanding how fear made me vulnerable to things like religion or anyone who was selling a solution to what I feared. Speaking of anger, I learned that not all anger is destructive. My parents encouraged me not to be loud or obnoxious and to keep my emotions in check. But sometimes we need to get angry. In that situation, anger is the best thing to feel. We cannot exist there forever, but it was essential to consider why I felt that way and what it was trying to tell me. As you may have already noticed, bypassing was a huge discovery for me. I never remember this being discussed in my 20 years of ministry, but looking back, I could see how it was deeply embedded in how we did church and our spiritual lives. Instead of leaning into issues, we would spiritually bypass them with platitudes and practices that pacified us while we went about our normal lives. I always thought I had a voice as a pastor, but I got to speak several times a week, and I was always the one they asked to pray. But when Laura and I wrote about her finding her voice after ministry, I realized that much of my experience was saying what people wanted me to say. It seemed like I was challenging them at times, but it was always within certain borders and boundaries. I also examined my inner critic's role in dysfunction because of its original intent. Some call the inner critic the protector. It was extremely helpful to take a closer look at that part of me that sabotaged me and led me down frustrating paths. When I went deeper and examined the origins of this part of me, I could heal even further and move to a more responsive way of being. Which leads us to step 3, learning to be. When I discovered that a better way of life was about being and becoming and not so much about doing, many things opened up for me. As I wrote the last section of my book, I titled the chapters Being With, and I felt like I was discovering the truth of each one as I was writing. For example, in the chapter Being with the Divine, I thought I was coming to understand it even more while I was writing it. In other words, I was also becoming even as I attempted to explain being. The first phrase or word is presence, and presence is being where you are or being where we are. Being where we are, presence. One of my most favorite teachers was Mrs. Beatty. In those days, teachers would take the role. They would say your name and then instruct you to say here or present. Both words meant the same thing at that time, but now we understand they can have different meanings. When my teacher asked, "Are you present?" she meant, "Are you here?" When Laura asked me, "Are you here?" she means, "Are you present?" I have been working at physical jobs for the past couple of years. Previously, I was in office with a management position. It's a long story, but I'm in transition and I do not have a long-term plan currently. So people often ask me, "What's the plan?" or "What will you do next?" To make that even more complicated, since writing this book and now recording it, I'm also disabled and stay at home most of the time. So people ask me, "What's the plan?" or "What are you going to do next?" And it's complicated. But my best answer today is today I am writing, or today I'm recording, or right now I'm working on an assembly line. I must tell myself the same thing every day. This is where I am, and this is what I'm doing. There's a time to visit the past, just like I explained in my story. Sometimes we at least need to have a felt sense of our past self, and we can do some genuine healing there. We also occasionally need to make some new plans, but future trips often lead us on unnecessary adventures into unproductive living. The best place we can be is where we are. This best part about being present is that it's not only that it makes us more productive, but it also can heal us. In addition to being where we have to be who we are, and that's authenticity. So being where we are is presence, being who we are is authenticity. Integrity is one of the most important things to me. I have many people who are not my best friends, but I hardly tolerate people I do not respect. Integrity is not just telling the truth, it's being truthful about who we are to ourselves. Many of us who went through religious deconstruction experienced a sort of PTSD. We ask ourselves, who am I? And what do I like to do? And what do I believe now? For so long, someone determined those things for us. But job one in evolving after deconstructing old beliefs is deeply examining and discovering who we are. Before we start chanting mantras about what we want to do and accomplish, we should set an intention to start becoming who we are. Understanding and living from a place of authenticity is my first intention for the second half of my life. I used to be determined to fit in because it made me successful, but now I want to be authentic because it helps me become more of who I've always been. So let's take a look at that word becoming, which is not a word that we normally use. I am becoming more of who I am. In a way, I'm becoming fully human. Each of us has an isness that is unique to us. Removing the layers of trauma and leaning into the pain of growing can shift us from the trauma and into a life of presence and authenticity. It is a being and becoming that I'm learning to embrace more fully. That is where I experience crisis and pain and learn to grow by stepping into them. This is where I connect with nature and learn more about the universe and the divine. I experience the presence of presence in every cell of my body. And when I'm with my dog, when I experience my body, and even when I'm uncertain. I enjoy solitude because I am never really alone. And even when I'm with difficult people, I exist with them in presence and authenticity. I discuss bravery and vulnerability in the last chapter of the Being book. More than anything else, people praise me for being vulnerable. Authors like Brene Brown realize there is no bravery without vulnerability. Just like moving forward involves pain, it also makes us vulnerable. I do not think that I can challenge you to play it safe and really encourage you at all. I encourage you to take the next courageous step. I realize that the next step will make you vulnerable and cause you some pain, but the pain subsides and you will start being and becoming who you always were. It will not be easy, but it will be worth it. Be who you are, be where you are, and be at peace.
Okay, so let's start with a little bit of discussion from your portion. So I just have a question about the idea of quitting. So you talked about that as the first step. So are there times when quitting is essential? So when I say that, I'm really referring to how we quit religion.
Mm-hmm.
So, are there times when quitting is essential? Can it be considered a positive thing?
Yeah. I would say one of the key words there is safety.
Yeah.
If you're in a marriage that's unsafe for you, that you at least need to separate or get away from it. For a lot of people, religion is also that way. That it's not safe. It's toxic. The patriarchy, the power and control, and all of that power differentials makes it sometimes impossible to get better
Right.
from that trauma while you're in that trauma. So that's definitely a great kind of side note warning add-on to all of this is that when you're in a situation that you need to take a step back from, maybe you need to bring people in to help you navigate that and mitigate whatever thing is there, like an abusive husband or an abusive priest or something like that. You need help.
Right.
And you also may need distance if you're ever going to get better, because otherwise we're getting re-traumatized every time somebody
Right.
doesn't believe us. Does that
Exactly.
make sense?
Yeah. And I mean, I think you have to take that mental health factor into some deep consideration. So, I mean, I want to make sure that we're not shaming anybody for or making them feel like they're quitting, especially when there's the idea of safety.
Yeah, and let's get real about stuff like that, like religion. That
Mhm.
does a horrible job at creating safe places.
Right.
Historically, at least in the United States, and at least in the past 100 years,
Mm-hmm.
it's been. And I know the first reaction is for someone to say, "Not at my church. We got a nice little country church."
Mm-hmm.
Well, you may not see everything about how the sausage is made, first of
Right.
all, but also just because yours is an exception doesn't mean it's not a widespread problem.
Right. And I feel also, and I've said this before, that if not, if it's not happening in your church and it is happening in other churches, that should be something that concerns you.
Yeah, still a problem.
As a person who considers himself a Christian, a follower of Christ, you should be concerned about those things. You should be concerned that there is any church out there that is toxic, possibly hurting people, shaming people, shunning people, all those things that we've talked about. Yeah.
That at the same time, healing, getting better, getting out of a situation like that, it's all that third response, leaning in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I can't just quit, and that's what most of us do. We kind of go into ourselves and we don't speak up,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and we don't speak against anything. We just kind of blend in, and then it never gets better.
Mm-hmm.
But leaning in is the response. You may have to get out. You may have to get some help. It's going to be harder than you thought. But leaning in is the only way to solve it. But you know, that doesn't mean that you stay right in the middle of a big church thing and try to fight the power differential, which is almost impossible to scale by yourself, especially.
Right. The other question I had is you were talking about that transition in your life where, you know, you had been working at several physical jobs and even desk jobs, and then you had a stroke. And so that was that transition in your life. So my question is, how helpful is it to ask someone in a transition of life, what will you do now? And I think, you know, yours was a medical transition, but even transitioning out of religion, you know, what will you do now? I mean, how helpful is that? And is there a better way or a better question to ask people? Because I feel like a lot of times when we ask that question, well, what will you do now? Um, maybe I'll just speak for myself. For me, it creates anxiety. I've got to be doing something. And isn't that part of the problem, especially inside of organized religion?
Yeah. You just create another job for that person.
Right.
It's like when people ask you if they could help when I was going through my stroke. It's like,
let me know what I can do to help you is what I would get a lot, which I know that comes from a very good place in someone's heart. I know that.
Yeah. But what that person is saying without realizing it is, I don't want to think about it too much. I don't want to use my own intuition and figure out what I could do to help you and offer that. Instead, they ask you, what can I do? Like you really feel like managing not only your husband's.
Well, what our new life is going to be like, the unknowns of that. And now I have this job of figuring out what all these people need to do to help us. When in reality, anything. I mean, even just a phone call or a text message.
Right.
You know.
Sometimes when you're going through a crisis, you're rebuilding, you're struggling, it has to be one day at a time, you know, regardless of all the cliches and songs about that. But that's just what we can manage right now. And I would assume from the stories that we've heard from abuse survivors and things like that, that the things you're focused on are small and achievable, and
sure,
you are trying to move forward. You are leaning in, but when someone says, "What's your 5-year plan?" There's no 5-year plan
Right.
because I don't even know if I'm going to walk. I don't even know if I'll ever use my hand
Right.
and things like that. So the plan today is to
hmm
survive, basically.
hmm Yeah. And I think, if you talk to anybody who's in business and they have goals and things like that, they may have some big goals. They may have a 5-year plan, but they also have little incremental steps that they're going to take today to help
Hmm.
them reach that 5-year plan.
Yeah.
And those are not insignificant.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. The way to go is leaning forward, and
hmm
we got to lean forward, realizing some days there's very little progress. It's slow. It's arduous. It's hard. All those things.
But important,
Yeah.
important work.
Absolutely.
Imposter syndrome. Sitting down to write this chapter is more challenging than the rest. Carl and I have been going back and forth discussing my feelings on being and becoming. I think my writer's block is due to imposter syndrome. I struggle to see that anything I say on this topic, let alone this book, is of value. I come by this naturally. I have always been a behind the scenes sort of person. As a small child, I struggled with ear infections so severely that it affected my hearing. So it just became easy for me to pretend I heard or understood rather than ask someone to repeat themselves for the millionth time. I just learned to be quiet and fade into the background, seeing what I had to say or contribute what as less than. I was in no way feeling sorry for myself. This was just a safer way of being. This saved me well in our church ministries. When Carl was called into ministry, I honestly had no feelings one way or the other. I was not a typical pastor's wife, wannabe, who jumped for joy when he broke the news to me. I was just, okay, sounds good. I also did not put up much resistance. I told him I would not be that pastor's wife who played the piano or the organ or led all the women's ministries. In other words, let me fade into the background. And this could be a sweet gig. It is incredible to me now, looking back, that this only reinforced my feelings of not belonging, not being heard, and not having a voice. In a way, I brought it on myself. But on the other hand, our church denomination was more than happy to let me assume the role of less than. In Carl's portion of this chapter, he discussed two elements that can inhibit belonging and one that can enhance it: quitting, numbing, and facing pain. I have never been a quitter in the physical sense of the word. I have not just thrown my hands up and audibly said, I quit, while stomping off and cussing up a blue streak. The way quitting shows up for me is very subtle. It is more of an emotional quitting. It is extremely easy for me to become noticeably quiet and emotionally checked out when things get complicated. You might not know it because I am physically still present, but emotionally, I am done. This happened in church for me. In our book, Out into the Desert, Thriving Outside of Organized Religion, I spoke at length about the harm I experienced in the church. It became pretty easy for me to go through the motions. I would show up, sing in the worship band, pray, and even sit in the front row and make eye contact, nodding my head in affirmation of whatever Carl was preaching that week. However, inside I was hollow and void of any emotion. It was as if I was back in my younger days, unable to hear, but not caring enough to ask anyone to repeat or explain what was happening. Emotionally, I quit. I could not give any more of myself. Typically, when someone quits something, they physically stop doing it. If you leave your job, you no longer are there. If you quit a sport, you stop playing it. The thing about emotionally quitting is that I was still attending these things and going through the motions. It was excruciatingly painful, and honestly, it still is as I write about it. No matter how much I would try to distance myself emotionally, the fact that I was still a part of it only created deeper wounds. Sometimes quitting is a healthy choice, but I realize there needs to be a clean break when deep work can happen and where deep work can happen. Otherwise, it is an exercise in futility. When you cannot quit your environment, which for me was attending church, the next best thing is to numb. I have had to take a hard look at this. Numbing is the act of not feeling or not dealing with your given situation. While it can take many forms, I do not numb with the typical things you might associate with numbing: alcohol, drugs, food, etc. Instead, for me, the way I numb or emotionally take myself out of a situation that is causing anxiety is to stay busy. Whenever we feel stuck, trying to find a way out of the situation is human nature. However, what if we cannot? What if we think we are entirely responsible for someone else's success and cannot express our truth? That is how church felt for me. I felt very responsible for Karl's ministry. I was the pastor's wife, and while I always said aloud that I would not be the typical pastor's wife, it was a slow fade into that life. I started to feel very responsible for making or breaking his ministry. There were unspoken rules that changed all the time. I could not keep up with them. So I kept myself busy to make sure I avoided accidentally breaking these unwritten, unspoken, vague at best rules. Nothing was off limits, but my doing centered around keeping the house organized, raising 3 children, being active in their various schools, and participating at church. Doing things kept my mind occupied, so I did not have to experience the very real feeling of not being in control. Honestly, I still struggle with this today. Life is good at throwing stuff at you that you were not expecting. In 2022, it was Karl's stroke, and one of our daughters and her child came to live with us. Do you know that meme that says, "It's fine, I'm fine, everything is fine"? That is me. On the outside, if I stay busy, no one knows the complete disarray of my emotional well-being. It is quite an elaborate front, and I play the part well. Work is my way of numbing. If I am busy doing it, I can quickly shove those emotionally broken parts into a metaphorical drawer. If I am busy doing it, the problem with that is these drawers cannot hold any more. Something must go. Numbing keeps my mind busy, so I do not have to deal with the overcrowding emotions. However, I have learned that I can choose to make space, or something inside of me will break. The latter never works out well for me, so I am still learning. While there is nothing wrong with being busy, it cannot be a substitute for dealing with my emotional well-being. I must come to a place where I can face and deal with my pain. I hate even saying that. When Karl started deconstructing, he always told me and others, "You have to lean into the pain." Why would I want to do that? Isn't life all about avoiding pain? Seriously, who goes looking for pain? If I do not face my pain, like the drawer analogy above, that pain is going to get stronger and do some damage when it breaks free. I have experienced this firsthand in my deconstruction. I still struggle with quitting and numbing. I suppose I always will, but I am learning to recognize when I get caught in those loops, or Karl helps me realize it. Facing the pain or leaning into it allows me to unpack who I am and what is important to me. It allows me to be a more authentic version of myself. While I sometimes get frustrated with the process, I am also okay with continuing to unpack those essential aspects of myself for however long it takes. If I never arrive, I'm okay with that. There is freedom in going through the pain and continually learning about the many facets that make up me. Imposter syndrome is something with which I will always struggle. In those very real moments of anxiety, I am learning to trust myself. We must believe each other's stories, even if they do not look like ours. I feel I can do that for you. The problem lies in doing it for myself. I must realize I do not have to be an expert at anything to tell my story. Part of my growth is giving myself the same compassion for where I have been and where my story is taking me. Today, I still struggle with my hearing. I am almost positive that I need hearing aids. The difference today is that I want to be a part of the conversation. I want to hear what you have to say, and I want to be heard.
Thanks for that description. And I know that you're very detailed in your description and so on, but I wanted to summarize with a couple of questions. So, as a pastor's wife, as someone that's engaged in the church, heavily active in church, been there a long time, pastor's wife, um, what what does quitting look like specifically to you? I tried to give some examples when I was writing, but my examples may not relate with other people, especially with women and pastors' wives and things like that. So what is quitting? What did it look like to you?
Well, I do think that in my most unhealthy state, which was inside of organized religion, I mean, I think that really looked like shutting down, just turning things off emotionally. Now that we are outside of organized religion and I've been through and I'm in therapy, and you know, I'm learning more to take a step back and evaluate what is going to serve my mental health well and what is not. And it is okay to say goodbye to those things that are not going to serve my mental
In some
health.
cases, it's good to quit, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's necessary.
It's
to quit.
necessary. And
Yeah.
we brought that up in our discussion with your part of the book too, that, if it's unsafe, if your mental health is at stake, it is okay to remove yourself from those things that are causing you trauma and that are toxic. Yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes it's necessary, but it's not the answer to solving the problem.
I
Right?
don't think you can just quit. Okay. And I say that meaning then there's some work that has to be done. Because what is it that feels toxic to you? What is it that you're storing? What trauma have you stored in your body because of that? You have to work those things out. You can't just go, I quit, and then not deal with it. That's bypassing, that's stuffing down. We may think in the moment that we feel better because now, I can breathe. I don't have that heaviness. For me, I don't have that heaviness of unrealistic expectations and unwritten rules that I have to follow, or am I even following them? So in that moment, I can breathe a sigh of relief that I don't have to deal with that. But if I don't lean forward, if I don't lean into the reasons why that was so necessary for me to quit that toxic relationship, then I am bound to repeat that. And I have seen that in my life where I have just substituted one toxic belief or behavior for another because I didn't do the work in between.
Yeah, that's a good explanation. That just because we quit, which was the right thing to do, get out of it, there's some, to me, in my story, it became real evident. Like it all came out at the same time.
Right.
Everything I'd been stuffing down. And I got free from the traumatic experience and the thing that was wounding me. Like you say, there's still work to be done. So we can't just keep quitting and avoiding
doing the work,
or we'll just be lonely and damaged,
Right.
So what about numbing? How did numbing come in for you?
Yeah, and I still struggle with this because when things get heavy, I get lost in my work. And so that was easy to do inside the church because we had small children when you entered the ministry. And
Mhm.
so there was always stuff to be done,
Mhm.
right? I stayed home for a while with our kids. And then I went and started substitute teaching at their school. And then I felt, I'll use air quotes, called to ministry as a teacher. Um, I don't know how I feel about that now. I mean, I'm glad that I'm a teacher, but I don't know how I feel about the whole called to be a teacher
Mhm.
thing. I might have to unpack that. But yeah, I mean, I think up until just recently, you know, I would spend my entire weekends either at school getting things ready for the next week. There's nothing wrong with being prepared, but you have to look at that. Like, am I doing this because I'm trying to not deal with some very real trauma that's going on?
Mhm.
And if I could get lost in my work, then I didn't have to deal with the
Yeah.
trauma that my body would feel when I was not busy.
I probably didn't realize it at the time, but at that same time, when you were early on in teaching, I was lost in hunting
Mm-hmm.
and video games.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my preferred way to numb.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think substance abuse has ever been an issue for us,
Mm-hmm.
but I've definitely been um, kind of the addictive kind of person
I think I
with
can be
with
too.
whatever,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's work
Mm-hmm.
or church
Mm-hmm.
or hunting or video,
Mm-hmm.
all those things just kind of avoid the hard stuff of facing
And I think
what's
sometimes
really
we
wrong.
kind of still fall into that, like,
Hmm.
because I teach a 4-day school week. So a lot of Mondays I have off. And so Saturday we might just be, you know, sitting around, for lack of a better word, watching some football or, you know, doing a lot of nothing, maybe small things here and there, but nothing really productive. But then by Sunday, I feel like, or at least Monday, we're like, man, we got to be doing something. We got to get out of the house. We got to
Hmm.
do something. So, I mean, I think it's important to take a look at that. There's nothing wrong with being busy. There's nothing wrong with doing things. There's nothing wrong with projects. But are we doing it? Are we having hobbies? Are we doing work? Are we keeping ourselves busy because we're trying to avoid something that we
Hmm.
really, really need to deal with?
Hmm.
I think that's the difference.
Yeah, good explanation. So also, then is leaning in, and you were kind of vocal about it in the book about that doesn't sound like something
And
I
I was
want to
pretty
do.
vocal about that, even like when I wasn't reading the book, and you would talk
Yeah,
about leaning in, and I was just like, "No, I don't want any part of that.
yeah,
I don't want to feel the pain, right?
yeah. I think there's so many examples you could give online about, being influencers or being um, whatever it is you're doing online, coaching or those kind of things. That many times it's that we lean in, we get all purposed and we're going to do this, we're going to lean in, but then it's hard,
Mm-hmm.
and this find the same thing with our pain or trauma. Go, okay, now I have a method, now I have a way, I
Mm-hmm.
understand it better. So I'll lean in, but that it was hard.
Yeah.
And even if I got results, do I want to go through that pain? Is what it feels like
Mm-hmm.
most often to
Mm-hmm.
me. But
I think, though, that the alternative to not leaning into the pain is stuffing it down,
mhm,
bypassing,
mhm,
never dealing with it. And I think I just slowly realized, because what was happening as I was not dealing with it and stuffing it down was kind of your experience when you went to the hermitage, right? Everything
mhm,
started coming out at once. And like I started having trouble sleeping at night. I started having memories of things that happened to me as a child. It was like my body could not store it anymore. Like that drawer metaphor that I kind of gave in that my part of the book, that drawer could not hold it anymore. And it was coming out in very scary and unsettling ways. And
mhm,
so but I want to encourage people that as you are leaning in, and you said this many times, is to find those trusted guides that can walk with you, be it a therapist, a trusted family member, or trusted friend, somebody that will hear you and listen to you and validate you, and help you just take those incremental steps that you need to take towards healing.
And if finding a guide sounds like a job, I just want to encourage you. The phrase we use quite a bit is that if you will, uh, so number one, you're going to have to start developing your intuition to where you sense that. But then the phrase sometimes used is the trusted guides will be there when you need them. And it's almost like they come to you instead of you having to find them. Because I think when we're looking for them, we're looking for a specific thing. But a lot of times that guide appears just at the right time, like several people have for me, at the right time, and they provide the right guidance that you need at that point. And then make sure you don't fall in love with them or create a religion around them,
Right.
and go back to church again. So they'll be there when you need them, and you'll develop your intuition. But all that's from leaning in and starting the process. Very good.
Lesson 5, action steps.
What areas of your woundedness do you sense that you need to face?
What are some areas that you tend to avoid going deeper?
How do you interpret the phrase learning to be?
How do you explain presence, authenticity, and becoming in your life?
Make an unedited list of the ways that you have quit, numbed, or avoided dealing with the necessary issues in your life.
We'll see you for lesson 6.